They call this the Oakhaven Confessions. It is not a confession of guilt. It is the final, desperate testament of a sane man trapped in a nightmare designed to look exactly like madness. I am Elias Thorne. And if this feed cuts out, if this blog goes dark mid-sentence, know this: I did not lose the fight to my own fractured mind. I lost it to the things that thrive in the cold brine and the ancient stories of Maine. You've already judged me. I see the comments, narcissistic, delusional, a cry for attention from a pathetic killer. Let them burn. I am not seeking absolution. I am documenting an extinction event. I am fighting for the silence that might protect you, the voyeur, from the hunger of what is chasing me. Oakhaven, Maine. A town perpetually drenched in the smell of low tide and old money rot. My family, the Thornes, have been its unofficial pariahs for 2 centuries. We own the sprawling granite monstrosity known simply as Thorne Manor, perched on the tallest sea cliff, a house that doesn't shield you from the Atlantic so much as absorb it. The town whispers about the mad Thornes, the patriarch who vanished, the aunt who spoke only in shanties, the uncle who claimed the fog had teeth. They believe the madness is genetic, passed down like the damp stone and the impossible debt. They are wrong. The madness is external. It is a presence that has always been here, waiting for the right kind of attention to manifest. I grew up in the echoing silence of that house, surrounded by portraits whose eyes seemed to follow the relentless march of the tides rather than the inhabitants. My mother, Eleanor, spent her life attempting to whitewash the legacy, filling the rooms with forced light and fragile optimism. But you can't disinfect history. You can only live beneath its heavy, waterlogged weight. I tell you this background because you need to understand the structural integrity of my sanity before the creature began tearing it down. I was a man of logic. I studied engineering. I believed in physics, not folklore. When I was admitted to St. Jude's following the first incident, the doctors agreed: traumatic brain injury, profound shock, temporary psychosis. A neat medical explanation that neatly packaged the supernatural terror and filed it under hallucinations, coastal variety. But the things I saw were not synapses firing erratically. They were deliberate, cold, and heavy with the scent of dried sea salt and forgotten depths. I am writing this now from the library of Thorne Manor. The fire is dead, the electricity is flickering, and the sound of the surf is not rhythmic. It sounds like massive, wet chains dragging across stone. I have boarded up every window facing the sea. The boards are useless, of course. The veil does not respect wood or glass, only narrative. I have limited time. I have structured this confession not as a journal entry, but as a forensic report detailing the creature's escalating strength and its methods. You must follow the progression. You must see the pattern. If I stop typing, it means the entity has crossed the threshold. It means the story is over for me, and the next phase of its life, its physical life, has begun. Do not try to find me. Do not call the police. The only way to starve this thing is through utter, complete, and total silence. If this story suddenly ends, erase it. Delete the blog, wipe the cache, burn the files. Do not share the final entry. Do not make a monument out of my failure. If you tell the end, you feed the hunger. This is the last warning. Read quickly. The shadows in the corners of this room are getting heavier, and the air smells like the inside of a rusted-out diving bell. The story begins where the sanity ended, on the docks, with Caleb. The 29th of March was the kind of night Oakhaven excels at, bone-deep cold, the fog so thick it felt like damp plaster pressing against your skin, and the moon a sickly, yellow blur above the low-hanging stratus. We were at the old shipping pier, the one that's been condemned since 1952, leaning against the rotting pilings. It was Caleb's farewell party. 2 men, a 12-pack of cheap beer, and a desperate, shared silence that was thicker than the fog. Caleb Avery had finally done it. He had secured a transfer far inland, Texas, maybe, anywhere that didn't smell like decay and salt. He raised his can in the gloom, his breath clouding heavily. "Here's to never seeing a goddamn lobster trap again, Elias." I managed a weak smile. I wanted to be happy for him, but Caleb was my anchor. He was the one person in Oakhaven who saw past the Thorne name and into the man. Or at least, the man I was trying to be. Losing him felt like cutting the last secure line to shore. The pilings were slick with algae, the air vibrating with the distant clanging of the warning buoy. I stood up to grab another beer, and that's when everything went wrong. I didn't trip on a rope. I didn't misjudge the edge. It felt like something yanked my feet out from under me. A brief, searing pain, then the world dissolved into noise. The sickening crack of my head against the wet wood, the metallic taste of blood, and the sudden, overwhelming sensation of falling upward instead of down. When I opened my eyes, the world was a kaleidoscope of crimson and gray fog. Caleb was screaming, his voice distorted by the rushing water in my ears. He was leaning over me, his face a mask of terror. I tried to speak, but the words were crushed in my chest. Then I saw it. And the vision was clearer, sharper, and infinitely more real than Caleb's worried face. It started with the rope. The mooring line Caleb was desperately trying to grasp snapped taut, not from the tension of the boat, but from something pulling it vertically. Caleb wasn't just leaning over me, he was starting to float. His eyes, wide and panicked, looked right past me, fixated on something towering behind my injured skull. The temperature plummeted. The air was not just cold, it was chemically inert. I watched Caleb, helpless, as his body lifted a foot off the pier, the rope that held him suddenly stiff and brittle, coated in a crystalline layer of white salt. And then the veil appeared. It wasn't a ghost in the classical sense, no shimmering outline or translucent sheet. It was a monolith of concentrated ocean dread. It was tall, impossibly so, dwarfing the mast of the nearest fishing vessel. Its form was merely suggested, a man, or the memory of one, draped in the heavy, sodden canvas of an 18th-century oilskin coat. The material seemed to drink the light, making the fog around it recede into unnaturally dark pockets. It smelled like the deep abyssal trenches, cold sulfur, and dead barnacles. Its texture was the most terrifying thing. It wasn't vapor, it was compressed fog, a solid sculpture of sea spray. But the face. There was no face. Where a human face should have been, there was only a vast, empty space, a yawning hollow defined by an impossibly wide, fixed grin. The grin was made of jagged, phosphorescent green light, like bioluminescent algae, stretching from shoulder to shoulder. It was a smile of pure, indifferent malice. The mariner's veil. That's what I named it later, in the psychiatric ward. It didn't touch Caleb. It didn't need to. It simply was. The entity leaned forward, and the pressure in the atmosphere changed. I heard a muffled, sickening sound, a sound like meat being pressed against dry ice. Caleb's eyes rolled back, and the rope around his waist cinched tight, fracturing his spine. His floating body tilted, and then, with unnatural speed, he was pulled backward, up and over the edge of the dock. There was no splash, only a dull, choked thump as he disappeared into the black water. I heard the siren next. Faint, distant blurring. I woke up 3 days later in the clean, sterile light of the County General Hospital. My skull had a neat line of staples, and the headache was a jackhammer working deep behind my eyes. The police were waiting. Detective Sergeant Rourke, a man who smelled perpetually of stale coffee and resignation. "Elias, we need you to walk us through the night." I told them about the slip, the concussion, the upward pull, the salt, the grinning figure, and Caleb's floating body. I described the sheer impossibility of the moment with meticulous detail. Rourke listened, his face hardening from professional sympathy to weary certainty. "Mr. Thorne, the autopsy report shows Caleb died from severe cranial trauma consistent with a sharp impact on the back of the head, followed by drowning. There was no rope constriction. There were no witnesses. You were disoriented from a serious fall. He was dragged," I insisted, trying to rip the floor from my arm, "by something huge, something made of salt water and night. You had a concussion, Elias. A bad one. We found an elevated level of phencyclidine in your system, too. Must have been in the beer." He sighed, already writing the final report in his head. "Accidental death," severe trauma combined with substance-induced delirium. They filed it away. But Oakhaven didn't. Oakhaven had centuries of practice finding the flaw in the Thornes. The whispers started before I was discharged. Elias Thorne, the troubled scion of the Mad family, finally snapped. He was jealous of Caleb's escape. He lured him to the docks. He hit him with something and dumped the body. The Oakhaven killer. I returned to Thorne Manor, not a survivor, but a fugitive in my own home. The police had cleared me of criminal intent, but the town had convicted me of moral degeneracy. The entity had vanished, but the atmosphere had changed. The manor felt colder, heavier. Every shadow seemed to hold a residual salinity. I could hear it sometimes when the house was completely silent, a low, scraping sound, like an anchor being dragged across sand 30 miles away. The veil had not faded into a memory. It had planted a seed of doubt in the world, and it was watching that seed grow. I started the blog then, 5 days after the funeral. I poured my terror onto the screen, a desperate attempt to externalize the paranoia, to find a single person who believed that coastal psychosis was not the answer. I began to sense its presence whenever I left the house, a pressure on the back of my neck, the overwhelming, nauseating smell of dead sea life accompanying me on every walk. I was being watched. Not by the police, nor by the suspicious townsfolk. I was being watched by something that had tasted the fear, and was now cultivating the perfect environment for its next appearance. The fear of being disbelieved, the crushing isolation, these were the nutrients for the mariner's veil. The first person who tried to genuinely help was Sarah Jensen. She worked at the Historical Society, a bright, fiercely rational woman who claimed she just needed to contextualize my trauma. The second was Mark Ellis, my old roommate from college, who flew into Oakhaven determined to drag me back to civilization. You need to change the scenery, Elias. This house is a coffin. Mark had insisted 2 weeks ago, trying to pry the window boards off with a kitchen knife. I couldn't leave. Leaving meant confirming the town's suspicion that I was fleeing justice. Leaving meant abandoning the spot where the entity had first manifested. I had to face it here, on the granite coastline it clearly claimed. We were near the Oakhaven Lighthouse last Tuesday night, a trip Sarah had suggested, claiming the structural integrity of the old light was comforting. It was anything but. The lighthouse stood on a narrow spit of rock, constantly battered by the spray. The air was misty, the sea churning below. Sarah was talking about local superstitions, tracing the history of shipwreck narratives, trying to find a benign explanation for my visions. Mark was leaning against the stone wall, smoking, complaining about the damp. Look, Elias, it was a hallucination. A monster made of brine and guilt. You were there, and Caleb died. It's survivor's guilt manifesting. That's all. Mark extinguished his cigarette on the wet stone, turning to face me. Before he could take his next breath, the air around him fractured. It happened without warning, without sound. One moment, Mark was there, solid, skeptical, alive. The next, the veil was upon him. This time, it wasn't a distant, foggy shape. It was there. It had gained density. The outline was still shrouded, heavy oilskins hanging like lead, but the form was now recognizably physical. It was taller than before, easily 8 feet, and I could see the underlying structure beneath the canvas, a framework of something rigid, like bone or dried driftwood. The smell hit first, an intense, suffocating blast of dried salt and ozone. It was the absence of moisture, the essence of the sea extracted and refined into a choking powder. Mark didn't scream. He didn't even register pain. The veil simply reached out a hand, a massive, articulated mass of green glowing material, and gripped his head. Then, Mark Ellis exploded. Not into blood or gore, but into mist. His skull imploded inward with a sound like a wet sack dropping onto stone, and the resulting eruption was a violent plume of red vapor and fine, gritty salt spray. For half a second, the entire scene was bathed in a horrible, sickly red fog that smelled like evaporated copper. I fell back, my ears ringing with a sound that wasn't a human cry but the roar of a million crushing waves. Sarah screamed, a sound high and thin, cutting through the spectral haze. She tried to run toward the lighthouse door, but the veil was faster. It moved not by walking, but by gliding, its form remaining perfectly upright despite the uneven rock. It raised its weapon. It was no longer formless. It held a curved hook, ancient and impossibly sharp, its surface the color of bleached bone or dried coral. A true mariner's weapon, long, heavy, and silent. It snagged Sarah. The attack was methodical and surgical, lacking any rage. The hook caught her across the abdomen, and with a swift, horrific movement, the veil ripped upward. Sarah's body convulsed, but the true terror was the substance that replaced her blood. Instead of the thick, dark fluid of life, what sprayed into the air was a clear, viscous, pale blue substance, saline solution, thick and strangely sweet-smelling, rapidly evaporating into mist as it hit the cold granite. The mariner's veil was dissolving life and replacing it with the sea's essence. I could only watch, paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated violation of physics. Sarah, writhing on the ground, wasn't bleeding out, she was evaporating. The veil turned to me, its gigantic, glowing green maw tilting slightly. The fixed grin was wider now, radiating a cold sense of satisfaction. It dropped Sarah's disintegrating body and stepped toward me. And then, for the first time, it spoke. The sound didn't come from the empty space that served as its face. It resonated inside my skull, bypassing my ears, striking my consciousness like a tuning fork made of ice. The voice was deep, scraping, and vast, the echo of sunken ships and drowned men. Asterisk. You will tell this story, Thorne. Asterisk. It was not a threat, it was a mandate. A commission. It lingered for a moment longer, its massive frame blotting out the intermittent beam of the lighthouse. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it dissolved back into the surrounding mist, leaving behind only the overwhelming stench of concentrated salt, the faint blue residue on the rocks, and two steaming, empty piles of clothing. When I finally managed to stumble back to Oakhaven, delirious and covered in Mark's salty residue, the police were already investigating the scene. Sarah's car was found nearby. The bodies were gone, vanished without a trace, the rocks cleansed by the high tide that followed. But Detective Rourke found my hunting knife, carefully wiped clean, lying near the high water mark. It wasn't mine, not really. It was my father's knife, kept in the manor's hunting drawer. The town did not need a confession this time. They had physical evidence. Elias Thorne, enraged by Mark and Sarah's intervention, had finally given in to the family curse, disposing of the bodies in the raging surf. The police were systematic, cold, and slow. But the internet was immediate. The comments on my blog, The Oakhaven Confessions, exploded. Troll, psychopath looking for fame. He killed them and now he's trying to make up a cheap horror story. The attention was catastrophic. The community was no longer questioning my sanity. They were celebrating my criminality, filling the comments section with outrage, fascination, and graphic theories about what I had done to my friends. I was now a verified spectacle. A killer documented through his own unreliable narration. And the mariner's veil had been given precisely what it demanded: an audience, a medium, and a dramatically escalating storyline. Its presence was no longer a shadow, it was a certainty. I could feel it gaining weight, feeding on the collective fear and disgust. The third act of this tragedy was about to begin, and I knew, with sickening certainty, who the star victim would be. My mother, Eleanor Thorne, was the final bastion of my defense. She had spent the last 2 weeks since the Lighthouse Incident navigating the police investigation and the media frenzy with a brittle, courageous grace. But even her facade was crumbling. She saw the true fear in my eyes, the cold certainty that defied logic, and she made the only decision a desperate mother could make. You need help, Elias. Not from the police, but medical help. Before they find another knife, before the town tears this house apart. On a Thursday morning, under the slate-gray sky, she drove me the 60 miles inland to the state psychiatric facility, St. Mary's. It was a brutalist structure of concrete and barred windows, meant to inspire discipline, not healing. It felt like the perfect place to bury the truth. We were in the intake area, a room smelling strongly of old bleach and faint anxiety. Eleanor was filling out the forms, her hand shaking as she detailed my delusional narrative. The veil arrived without the courtesy of fog or shadow. It arrived in the middle of a perfectly lit, sterile room at 10:47 a.m. The escalation was terrifying. The entity was no longer a sculpture of sea spray. It was almost perfectly, tragically mortal. Its body was the color of deep-sea trenches, a bruised, mottled bluish-gray. Its skin was no longer smooth mist but deeply wrinkled, taut like old, waterlogged leather stretched over heavy, misshapen bones. It looked less like a ghost and more like a drowned man 3 centuries overdue for burial. The oilskin coat was now thick, green with mold and perpetually dripping a viscous, oily fluid. This was the mariner's veil, level 3, the tangible specter. It didn't phase through the walls. It shattered the reinforced glass doors leading to the courtyard with a sound like a wet cannonball strike, sending shards of glass flying with lethal force. Eleanor screamed, dropping the clipboard. The veil fixed its attention solely on her. I lunged forward, yelling a useless, animal sound, but I was too slow. The veil moved with the slow, deliberate momentum of a force of nature. It held a weapon I hadn't seen before, a length of heavy, rust-eaten rebar or perhaps a piece of a shattered mast, indistinct and oily. It raised the rebar high, the weapon reflecting the fluorescent lights, giving it a sickly sheen. The sound that followed was the end of all hope, the final, undeniable proof that I was not mad. It was a sickening, crushing blow, heavy steel impacting bone with impossible force. The veil beheaded my mother. Eleanor Thorne's body slumped instantly, followed by the clatter of the rebar as the veil tossed it aside. The severed head struck the sterile linoleum floor and rolled once, coming to rest near a discarded medical glove, her eyes frozen in a final, horrifying realization of the truth. The room erupted into pandemonium. Doctors, patients, and nurses began to flee or collapse into catatonia. The veil didn't hesitate. It began its harvest. I watched, frozen in a horror that transcended pain, as the entity moved through the intake hall with terrifying efficiency. It wrapped a length of what looked like heavy, barnacle-encrusted hawser cable around the neck of a terrified young nurse, twisting slowly until the light faded from her eyes. It seized the antique ceremonial musket from the security guard's desk, a decorative piece, and the weapon instantly came to life, spraying not lead, but pressurized, burning jets of crystallized salt that shredded the flesh of 2 orderlies. I saw worse. Unspeakable, animalistic violence performed against the vulnerable, actions so grotesque and devoid of humanity that they stripped away any pretense that this was a spectral entity playing games. This was pure, concentrated, physical hatred, now fully unleashed. It seized a visibly pregnant woman, a patient in her 3rd trimester, and used the rusted rebar to commit an act of violation so monstrous and specific that the image is permanently etched into the most protected corner of my brain, an act intended not just to kill, but to utterly dehumanize the narrative of life itself. I finally found movement. Driven by a blind, primal need for vengeance, I grabbed a scalpel from an abandoned medical tray. It was thin, sharp, and utterly useless. I roared and lunged, burying the scalpel deep into the back of the veil, aiming for what I hoped was a spine or a kidney. The blade went in clean. Too clean. I felt the resistance of thick, fibrous material, like old sponge or saturated wood. No blood. No muscle. The scalpel passed through the dense, waterlogged form and poked out the other side. The veil didn't even twitch. It completed its current act of destruction, snapping the neck of a fleeing orderly, before slowly turning its full, massive focus back to me. I stood there, my hand gripping the scalpel embedded in its back, utterly defeated. The veil leaned down, the stench of brine and rotting seaweed washing over me. Its dark, cavernous eyes, 2 pits of absolute blackness, locked onto mine. Its voice, the chilling echo in my mind, was almost tender now, steeped in profound satisfaction. Asterisk. Beautiful, Elias. Write about this. Recount every detail. Your story needs these peaks. Asterisk. It didn't kill me. It simply pulled the scalpel out of its body with a slick, sucking sound and tossed it away. It had consumed enough. It had proved its power. It had proved my guilt. When the state police arrived minutes later, delayed by a convenient, heavy fog bank on the highway, they found a scene of total carnage, bodies mutilated in ways that suggested a highly specialized, human killer. They found me, standing catatonic amidst the remains, holding the bloody rebar handle. The veil must have placed it there. There was no negotiation left. No plea of innocence. I was covered in Eleanor's blood. I was the last man standing. I was the sole survivor of a maniacal slaughter. I ran. I broke a window, scrambled to the parking lot, and stole the first serviceable car I found, driving madly eastward, back toward the coast, back toward the only place where the lines between reality and nightmare had completely dissolved. The mariner's veil had achieved full realization. I was no longer its victim. I was its devoted chronicler, trapped in the role of the mad killer I had tried so desperately not to be. I drove for 18 hours until the gas gauge hit E. I ended up deep in the Oakhaven wilderness, miles from any paved road, seeking refuge in the Thorne family's dilapidated hunting cabin. It was small, cold, and smelled of pine needles and ancestral decay. I had failed. I had tried to tell the story to defeat the monster, but I had only fed it. The more detail, the more terror, the more attention my blog received, the more physical and effective the veil became. Caleb was a shadow, Mark and Sarah were vapor, Eleanor and the hospital staff were concrete, bloody reality. I was huddled in the dark, the laptop burning against my knees, ready to post the account of the St. Mary's Massacre, the grand finale of my descent into madness. But a tiny, fragile thread of resistance still held. I needed to understand why. Why me? Why the Thornes? Why narrative? I had spent my life avoiding the ghosts of this house, but now I sought them out. I began tearing the floorboards up in the main cabin room, remembering my mother's terrified warning never to touch anything the first Thornes had left behind. Beneath a massive, rotten section of pine, I found it, a small, lead-lined iron box, corroded by 2 centuries of damp. Inside was a single, fragile leather-bound journal and a sealed parchment letter, dated 1804. The signature read, Augustus Thorne. Augustus was the patriarch who vanished. The ancestor whose madness had allegedly started the family curse. I peeled back the aged parchment, and began to read his careful, cursive script, illuminated by the dying laptop screen. The terror on the page was palpable, a chilling echo across the centuries. Augustus wrote of a horrific winter, the destruction of the fishing fleet, and the visitation of a shadow of the tide, which he called the Umbra Marini. The description was unmistakable: the vast height, the oilskin, the crushing pressure, the silent, grinning void. The veil. Augustus chronicled the brutal, unexplained deaths of his peers, deaths that the town initially blamed on accidental hypothermia, but which Augustus knew were acts of deliberate butchery. Then came the horrifying explanation, the core truth that cracked my universe into sharp, useless fragments. The horror does not seek victims, Elias, Augustus wrote, his ink spattered with what looked suspiciously like dried brine. It seeks an audience. It requires a chronicler. This entity, this shadow, it is a parasite of narrative. It gains mass and strength not through blood, but through the propagation of its atrocity. Fear is its food, but shared documentation is the mechanism of its metabolism. Every scream recorded, every terror detailed, grants it a measure of tangibility. It feeds on the telling. Augustus realized that the more people whispered about the bloody winter, the stronger the entity became. The veil was evolving through the very mechanism intended to warn the world. He described his desperate final act. To save the town, to starve the monster of its fuel, Augustus made the ultimate sacrifice. I cannot allow the story to be told, the letter continued. Therefore, I must become the monster. I have slaughtered the few survivors left in this valley, men, women, and children, and arranged their bodies in a manner that points only to human malice, to my human malice. I will leave the journal. I will be caught, or I will perish, and the town will have its definitive answer. The Thorne line is cursed, driven to cannibalistic madness. The true source of the terror will be buried under the official, believable lie. Augustus had succeeded in trading his reputation and his life for the town's safety. He had taken the blame for the monster's actions, ensuring the narrative died with him. He made himself a murderer to prevent the world from hearing about the Mariner's Veil. But the Veil knew. Augustus's final entry was smudged, written in frantic terror. Asterisk, the shadow blocks the door. It says, "You cannot die, Thorne. You are my lighthouse. You must shine." Asterisk. Augustus Thorne didn't vanish. He was silenced. I dropped the journal, the realization washing over me like icy seawater. My blog, the Oakhaven Confessions, which I had intended as a warning beacon, was a banquet. I had spent months detailing the escalating horror, providing meticulous accounts of the impossible crimes, feeding the monster with the very attention I was so desperate to escape. Caleb's death was minor, Mark and Sarah's was a substantial meal, the Hospital Massacre was a feast. I had been the Veil's most dedicated, most essential collaborator. I had given it flesh. I had written it into existence. I looked at the laptop screen, blinking back the cursor, ready to type the next, most spectacular chapter, the final, bloody account of St. Mary's. But I couldn't. If I posted this, the Veil would achieve not just tangibility, but permanence. It would be unstoppable. The sound started then, outside the flimsy wooden walls of the cabin. Not the distant drag of an anchor, but a clear, heavy, squelching footstep on the pine needle floor. Slow, deliberate, and undeniably real. The Veil had followed its story. It was here to collect its final fee. The Veil entered the cabin, but it didn't use the door. It simply expanded, materializing out of the single deep shadow cast by the window frame. This was no longer the entity of fog or the spectral drowned man. This was the final stage. The completely realized, fully materialized monster. It stood before me, a towering, sickeningly detailed caricature of a sailor. The oilskins were heavy, cracked leather, smelling overwhelmingly of petroleum and ancient kelp. Beneath the canvas, I could now see the detail of its physique, a framework of impossibly dense, salt-encrusted bones, like bleached driftwood bound tightly with black fishing line. Its arms were long, ending in massive, clawed hands stained dark with the blood of the hospital. Its eyes were deep-set, wet, and utterly black, like two pools of crude oil. The jaw, where the fixed green grin once resided, was now a functional mouth, lined with needle-sharp, shark-like teeth covered in bits of clinging, green seaweed. Every movement produced a scraping, creaking sound, like a boat hull straining in a hurricane. The Mariner's Veil was real. It took a single step toward me, and the floorboards groaned in protest. It was physical weight, a force measurable in pounds and inertia. "Thank you, Elias Thorne." The voice was no longer just in my head, it was guttural, wet, and rasping, tearing at the air of the small cabin. "You are my greatest chronicler. You gave me the volume I required. You made the story so compelling." It gestured with one enormous, heavy hand toward the laptop. "You are done. I am fully realized. Oakhaven is mine. And soon the coast will be mine." I knew, with cold clarity, that I could not fight it. I could not kill it. The scalpel passed through its substance because its power was still primarily narrative. To kill it, I would have to destroy the idea of it, the story. I looked at the laptop. The final, fatal entry was waiting to be published. I couldn't follow Augustus's path. I couldn't become a serial killer to bury the tale, because the Hospital Massacre already did that job for me. The Veil's story was already public, it just needed the final, horrific details to cement its material presence. There was only one way to ensure the story died. I frantically typed a brief, final message. Not on the blog itself, but in a private, encrypted chat window to a particularly obsessed, anonymous commenter, a man who had spent months analyzing the metadata of my posts, believing they held the key to a vast government conspiracy. Asterisk, the key is attached. Access the blog. You have 3 minutes from the time this message sends. Delete everything. Wipe every confession. Every picture. Every reference to the veil, Caleb, Sarah, and the hospital. If you fail, the world burns. Asterisk. I hit send. It was a terrible risk, trusting a stranger with the final fate of the world, but only an outside agent could clean the slate completely. My name, Elias Thorne, would forever be synonymous with a series of fabricated, insane delusions, but the veil would lose its foundation. It would be reduced to a collection of scattered, deleted fragments. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark. The veil watched patiently, its black eyes shining with amusement. It knew my final act was defiance, but it was too confident in its new, solidified form to care. I stood up, ignoring the monster that occupied the space 5 feet in front of me. I walked to the old mantelpiece where my grandfather's double-barreled shotgun sat, dusted, and loaded with buckshot intended for deer. You won the story, Vale, I whispered, pulling back the hammers with a metallic clack-clack. But I control the ending. Ah, the suicide note. A classic flourish, the entity rasped, a sound like grinding stone. It will make the final police report even more poignant. More narrative. No, I said, placing the barrels against my temple. It won't be in the report. It won't be posted. This death is for the silence. March 29th was supposed to be a farewell, not an execution. The air hung thick and cold, smelling of brine and rust, the kind of pervasive chill that only settles into the marrow of coastal Maine when the winter refuses to concede. Caleb and I stood on the rickety, abandoned pier near the old cannery, the place where we'd carved our initials 17 years earlier. There were 2 cheap 6-packs of Narragansett on the salt-stained planks and the shared, sad silence that accompanies the end of a long chapter. Caleb was leaving Oakhaven, fleeing the suffocating silence and the rot of the sea, heading inland for college or maybe just to disappear into a place where the dirt wasn't constantly eroding beneath his feet. He was laughing, his breath misting brightly against the black canvas of the sky. He had just finished telling me about the horrible, pretentious job interview he had botched, and the sheer relief in his voice was palpable. You know, Elias, he'd said, taking a deep, shuddering gulp of the beer, I almost regret leaving you here to deal with the ghosts of Thorne House all by yourself. I remember reaching out, maybe to playfully shove him, maybe just to steady myself, because the pier was slippery with algae and seawater. The irony of that small, friendly gesture still claws at me. The moment my hand connected with his shoulder, my foot slipped on a patch of slick moss I hadn't seen. The next few seconds were a distorted blur of terrible noise, the crack of my skull against a support beam, the sound of splintering wood, Caleb's shocked yell, and then the gut-punching, freezing shock of the North Atlantic swallowing me whole. I didn't lose consciousness immediately. Instead, I entered a state worse than fainting, a vibrating, agonizing half-presence where the world warped around the searing pain in my temple. Water filled my lungs, and the immediate panic was blinding, but before the darkness could completely claim me, something pulled me up. Not strong hands, but the relentless, rising tide of hallucination born from severe cranial trauma. I was no longer submerged, yet I was drowning in sight and sound. The ringing in my ears became a hollow, subterranean roar, and when I finally forced my eyes open, the pier was gone. I was suspended in a sickly, gray haze that tasted only of salt and old, dead things. Caleb was there. He was floating several feet above the water line, tethered to something impossibly long and thick, a rope made not of hemp, but of woven bone and mineralized salt crystals. His face was twisted, his lips struggling to form words, his eyes wide and pleading, focused not on me, but on the thing that held him captive. That was the first time I saw the mariner's veil. It defied physical categorization. It was colossal, easily 12 feet tall, a columnar mass of swirling sea foam, pressurized mist, and black, wet iron. It seemed to have no true edges, dissolving and resolving simultaneously, yet it possessed a terrible, coherent shape, the exaggerated silhouette of a man wearing a thick, high-collared coat that seemed to weep brine. Its face was the void I have been running from ever since. It wasn't merely obscured, it was actively wrong. Where eyes and a nose should have been, there was only the smooth, unblemished texture of hardened salt deposits, reflecting the pale moonlight like polished marble. And beneath that blank expanse was the mouth, a gash stretched impossibly wide, revealing nothing but profound darkness. It wasn't a smile of mirth. It was a grin of utter, oceanic indifference, a silent, empty commitment to malice. The mariner's veil didn't move much. It simply hovered, colossal and ancient, drawing Caleb towards it by that impossibly rigid rope. I tried to scream, tried to reach out, but my limbs were leaden and useless. The entity looked down at me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze penetrate the concussion, the alcohol, and the fear, settling deep into the ancient, dusty corners of my lineage. There was no noise from it, only the deafening mental echo of the sea floor and the sensation of overwhelming, ancient hunger. The last thing I saw before the true blackness took me was Caleb's body beginning to stretch, the salt rope pulling taut, and the wide, vacuous mouth of the veil opening just slightly wider. I woke to the synthetic smell of disinfectant and sterile linen, the white glare of the ceiling lights above me at Oakhaven General. The concussion roared in my skull, but the terror was louder. The salt haze was gone, replaced by the hum of machinery and the brisk movements of nurses. Caleb was dead. They found his body an hour later, snagged on the remnants of a lobster trap a quarter-mile down the coast. The cause was drowning, complicated by severe head trauma consistent with falling from a height. When the officers came, Detective Rourke, a man who had known my father, the questioning was less about investigation and more about confirmation. They had their narrative ready. "Mr. Thorne, your medical report indicates a grade 3 concussion and extremely elevated alcohol levels," Rourke said, his voice flat, his notebook poised. "You told the paramedics you saw a creature? A sea monster pulling your friend?" I tried to explain the crushing cold, the salty texture of the air, the grinning form that wasn't fog and wasn't flesh. But my words sounded brittle and insane, even to my own ears. A colossal man made of sea foam and hatred. Rourke simply sighed, clicking his pen shut. "Elias, what you experienced was a classic trauma-induced delusion. A way for your mind to process the horror of watching your friend die while you were helpless. It's common. We found no evidence of any other person, or any entity on the pier. They ruled Caleb's death an accident. But Oakhaven has a long memory and a potent distrust of the Thorne family. We weren't just the oldest family, we were the family defined by madness. The sea witch's line," they whispered. I was released a week later, physically healed but psychologically shattered. The town's pity was colder than the ocean itself. People didn't look at me, they looked through me. The whispers started immediately, circulating through the diners and the docks. Elias Thorne, the troubled son of the troubled Thornes, probably just shoved his friend off the pier while drunk and then concocted a monstrous lie to cover it up. The fact that the police bought the hallucination theory was only proof to the locals that the police were inept, not that I was innocent. The guilt was a crushing weight, but the true terror was the knowledge that the police were wrong. I had seen it. I knew the moment Caleb died, something ancient and hungry had taken its fill. And worse, as I sat alone in Thorne House, surrounded by the silence of centuries, I realized that the salt wasn't just on the planks of the pier. The faint, briny scent, the smell of death and old ice, seemed to cling to my clothing, to the walls, to the air itself. Every time I stepped outside, even miles from the harbor, I felt the phantom presence. A tall, cold shadow lingering just at the edge of my peripheral vision, observing me with a silent, vast, and empty grin. The mariner's veil had looked at me that night, and now it was watching. I wasn't just a survivor, I was its chosen audience. The Oakhaven Confessions was the only tether I had left, the digital shore I clung to while the tide pulled me under. I wrote until my fingertips bled against the keys, churning out the incoherent, desperate reality the town refused to see. It wasn't a hallucination. Caleb died, but something else killed him. I knew I sounded like a man drowning in mercury, but the alternative, accepting that Caleb's death was merely a tragic slip and that the lingering chill in my spine was just guilt, that would have meant surrendering to the void. I kept repeating the details: the salt smell, the impossible height, the blank, wide smile hidden behind the mist. I needed validation, but all I received was scorn. My friends, bless their naive hearts, tried to intervene. Sarah Jensen, a nursing student with the patience of a saint, and Mark Ellis, who still believed a six-pack and a Bruins game could fix anything. They drove up from Portland, convinced I was suffering from severe, untreated post-concussion syndrome coupled with grief. "Elias, look at me," Sarah pleaded, running a hand across my unshaven jaw in my kitchen, which had become a mausoleum of dirty dishes and typed-out madness. "You haven't slept properly in weeks. The police ruled it an accident. The town is talking, Eli. They think you pushed him and the guilt is manifesting as this Mariner's Vale character." Mark, always more pragmatic and less gentle, leaned against the counter. "Dude, your blog is viral, but not in a good way. People are comparing you to that California cult leader. Delete it. Get clean. We'll take you back to the city." I backed away from them, my own house suddenly feeling like a glass cage. "You don't understand. He's here. Sometimes I feel him breathing the sea air right outside the window. He wants the story to be told. He needs it." They exchanged the sad, pitying glance that had become a universal language in Oakhaven whenever my name was mentioned. I agreed to go for a walk, a concession to their concern. Mark suggested the old Oakhaven Lighthouse Trail. It felt like a deliberate act of cruelty, leading me back to the edge of the water, but I couldn't refuse. The sun was dipping, painting the rocky coast a deep, bruised purple. The sea was restless, tossing massive gray waves against the granite base of the structure. We reached the base of the winding steps. Sarah was talking about her final exams. Mark was distracted, scrolling on his phone. It was the absolute banality of the moment that made the transition to absolute horror so shattering. The first sign was the smell. Not the clean, sharp scent of salt spray, but a dense, suffocating odor of cured brine and ancient, drying seaweed, like 1,000 rotting catches laid out under a humid sun. It hit us like a physical force, stopping Mark mid-scroll. Before any of us could articulate the dread rising in our throats, the veil arrived. It didn't drift in like fog this time, it coalesced. From the shadow cast by the lighthouse itself, a shadow that moved when the light should have held it still, something immense and defined stepped out. It was still predominantly a blur of gray and white static, but the sheer volume of it was terrifying. It wore the silhouette of a man unnaturally tall, clad in what looked like heavy, saturated oilskins made of solidified mist. Where its face should have been, there was still only that depthless, gaping blackness and the suggestion of that terrible, inhuman smile. Mark was closest. He instinctively yelled, a useless, truncated noise. The veil didn't use hands. It didn't need to. There was a sound like a wet sheet tearing, and Mark's head, his entire skull and brain, didn't explode with blood, but with a horrifying, high-pressure burst of crimson mist and crystalline salt. The air immediately thickened, stinging our eyes. I stood frozen, watching the remains of my friend collapse, leaving behind a slick of pungent, red-tinged grit on the granite. It was blood mixed with the sea itself, purified and weaponized. Sarah screamed, a sound that ripped through the howling wind. She didn't run toward the path. She was too stunned, too close to the edge. The entity moved with terrifying swiftness, no longer the slow, dragging presence of the bent Tau. It carried a weapon now, a massive, antique gaff hook. It wasn't metal, but bone-white material, polished smooth by centuries of friction with the sea floor, ending in a wickedly sharp, yellowed point. It hooked Sarah's torso, not carelessly, but with sadistic precision, lifting her into the churning darkness above its shoulder. Sarah thrashed, but the entity held her fast. The sound she made wasn't human pain. It was the gurgle of lungs filling with brine. I watched in paralyzing horror as the entity used the hook to slowly, deliberately tear her open. The material that spilled out wasn't thick, warm blood. It was a torrent of dark, brackish liquid, pure salt water that smelled of the deep ocean trenches. The veil was dissolving her, replacing her vitality with the relentless, sterile purity of the sea. She went limp, hanging on that massive, bone-white hook like a discarded fish. I finally found my voice, a ragged, useless cry of utter defeat and terror. I stumbled forward, my knife, the knife I always carried for camping, the knife the police would later find, clutched uselessly in my hand. The mariner's veil turned its massive, mist-shrouded head toward me. For the first time, it didn't just feel like a shadow. It felt solid, weighty, an anchor of pure terror. Its black eye sockets were like twin holes punched into reality. Then the voice. It wasn't spoken by lungs or a throat, but resonated directly within the bones of my skull, a cold, scraping sound, like sand being dragged across glass, simultaneously ancient and immediate. You will tell this story, Thorne. It dropped Sarah's ruined body back onto the rocks, the impact muffled and disgusting. The veil then simply dissolved, not quickly, but like steam venting from a broken pipe, leaving behind only the acrid, dry smell of high-grade salt and the undeniable, horrifying evidence of its reality. I don't remember calling 911. I don't remember the piercing sirens blending with the roar of the surf. I only remember kneeling in the cold spray, rocking back and forth, the salt residue of Mark's head stinging my wet face. When the police arrived, I was covered in the evidence of two impossible deaths. Detective Hayes, the same man who had handled Caleb's death, stared at the scene, the unique, saltwater-soaked wreckage of Sarah, the strange crystalline residue that was once Mark, and then at my blood-spattered hands. They quickly found my camping knife near the scene. It was clean of human blood, strangely, but it was my knife. The official story, carefully leaked by the Oakhaven PD, was swift and damning. Elias Thorne, unstable son of the Mad Thorne family, traumatized by the accidental death of his friend, had snapped. Mark's unusual death was attributed to a severe head injury from the fall and subsequent lacerations. Sarah's gruesome injuries were ascribed to a brutal, targeted stabbing by a psychotic Elias before he threw her body onto the jagged rocks. The online world, previously a source of morbid curiosity, turned into a digital mob. My confessions were no longer seen as the ravings of a victim, but the carefully crafted manifesto of a narcissistic killer seeking viral fame. Asterisk. The Thorne psycho needed more material for his horror blog. 2 innocent lives just to boost his readership. Asterisk. Asterisk. He killed them because they tried to help him. Typical attention seeker. Asterisk. Asterisk. Delete the blog, delete the sick bastard's platform. He's feeding off the drama. Asterisk. They were right about one thing, I was feeding it. But it wasn't drama I was providing, it was fear, amplified by the written word. And the veil had just grown exponentially stronger. I looked in the mirror that night, and for a fleeting, horrifying second, I thought I saw not my own reflection, but the outline of that wide, blank smile superimposed over my face. I was the narrator, and the story demanded blood. This is the last entry before the end. If I stop posting, you will know exactly why. I have nothing left to lose now. They said this place, the massive concrete edifice miles inland, was safe. Eleanor drove me. My mother. She was exhausted, pale, but she held my hand the whole way, telling me it would be all right. That the doctors here specialized in trauma, in deep delusional psychosis. She didn't believe the confessions, but she believed in me. That was enough. That was my last sliver of hope. The facility, Westbrook State Asylum, smelled of antiseptic and old linen, a clean, sharp smell that tried desperately to mask the deeper odor of human despair. We were in a small waiting room, the light fluorescent and buzzing, offering a sterile, false sense of security. I felt the familiar cold dread coil in my stomach. The mariner's veil never seemed far, but surely, miles from the coast, divorced from the salt and the history, it would be weaker here. I was wrong. The air pressure dropped. It wasn't a sudden storm. It was a physical subtraction of warmth and life from the room. Eleanor looked up, her hand tightening on mine. She didn't see the thing immediately, but she felt the change. The shift from clinical stillness to pure, corrosive malice. The veil didn't glide this time. It marched. It filled the doorway, no longer a silhouette of shimmering salt. The transformation was complete. The thing was now a hulking, terrifying embodiment of the sea's forgotten fury. Its skin was no longer mist, but a dense, blue-gray hide, textured like old, waterlogged ship timber and crusted with barnacles that scraped against the doorframe. Its limbs were thick, corded with the dark purple of deep-sea blood vessels, and its eyes were twin pits of churning, toxic brine. If the previous appearances were ghosts sculpted by fog, this was the nightmare made solid, the horror distilled into a physical form, smelling intensely of ozone and the decaying heart of a drowned leviathan. This was level 3. This was the result of 200 years of silence and the sudden, explosive energy I had fed it through these confessions. "Elias," Eleanor whispered, standing in front of me. She saw it now. The thing had brought the storm with it. The veil did not speak first. It moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a tidal wave. It had no need for the ancient, milk-white hook now. In its massive, splintered hand, it held something found nearby, a length of heavy, corroded iron, perhaps a relic of some forgotten boiler or a broken pipe from the maintenance tunnels beneath the hospital. I screamed her name, lunging forward, but the air around the creature was thick, pressing down, slowing my muscles as if I were underwater. Eleanor, bless her brave, exhausted heart, didn't run. She stood her ground, momentarily shielding me from the sheer scale of the horror. The blow was fast, sickeningly definitive. The iron pipe swung, and it struck my mother across the neck with such force that the sound was less a crack and more a wet thud that echoed in the silence of the corridor. Her head didn't roll, but the impact was absolute. She collapsed instantly, not a drop of conventional blood, but a spray of something dark and viscous, the color of old motor oil mixed with seaweed, that coated the institutional wallpaper. She was gone. My protector. My witness. My anchor. Severed from the world by the physical manifestation of my guilt. Rage, pure and blinding, overrode the fear. I stumbled over her body, my hands grasping for anything. I found a scalpel tray on a nearby cart. I snatched the gleaming blade, the only weapon I had, and plunged it wildly toward the creature's chest. It didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice. The scalpel passed through the blue-gray hide, through the barnacle clusters, and exited the back, making no sound, encountering no resistance. It was physical enough to murder my mother, but still utterly untouchable by human steel. The mariner's veil looked down at me, the deep brine in its eye pits swirling, and then, slowly, a sound escaped it. Not the echoing voice from my mind, but a grating, scraping sound, like stones being dragged over wet sand. It was laughter. Then the massacre began. The horror that unfolded next proved that the veil was no longer a vengeful ghost or a local legend. It was a physical force dedicated to theatrical, absolute destruction. It wasn't interested in silence. It wanted a masterpiece of pain, and it knew I was the one documenting the gallery. A night nurse, a kind woman named Martha who had offered me crackers only an hour before, ran out into the hall at the sound of the disruption. The veil didn't bother with the pipe. From its shoulder, a length of heavy, ancient mooring rope, thickly encrusted with barbs and dried brine, detached itself like a parasite. It lashed out, wrapping around Martha's throat, pulling taut. She struggled for perhaps 3 seconds, her face turning crimson, before the barbs tore through skin and cartilage, silencing her desperate wheezing forever. The rope retracted back into the creature's body like a hungry tongue. A security guard attempted to fire his pistol. The bullets hit the veil's chest with hollow clicks, flattening instantly against the waterlogged timber skin. The creature raised its other hand, and I saw a horrifying piece of nautical weaponry materialize, a phantom blunderbuss, its brass cracked and green with age. It didn't fire lead shot. It fired a deafening blast of concentrated salt vapor and pulverized bone. The guard's face dissolved instantly, turning into a steaming ruin of red mist and crystallized tissue. The smell was overpowering: sea salt, burned ozone, and the coppery scent of vaporized life. But the worst was yet to come. The horror that confirmed that this thing was not just evil, but utterly depraved, feeding on the very concepts of safety and hope. A young woman, a patient who was heavily pregnant, having been admitted for severe postnatal depression during her first pregnancy, came out of a room whimpering. She was seeking refuge, seeking help. She saw the mess, she saw the bodies, and she froze. The veil turned its massive head toward her, its watery eyes focusing with clinical precision. It did not use a quick weapon. It approached her slowly, deliberately. I watched, paralyzed and screaming internally, as it reached out a hand, not to strike, but to touch. The barnacle-encrusted fingers pressed against her swollen abdomen. I heard the sound then, the most terrible sound I have ever heard, a sound that proves the devil is real and lives in the deep. The wet, tearing slurp as the life, the potential for life, was drawn out of her. She buckled, collapsing into a heap of empty flesh and torn clothing, aging a lifetime in 3 horrifying seconds. The veil inhaled deeply, its chest expanding, and I saw a brief flicker of light within its depths, a horrifying sense of satisfaction. It had consumed not just a soul, but a future. I was crawling on the slick floor, useless, the scalpel falling from my numb fingers. I was soaked in the residue of my mother and the salt spray of the dead. I was completely broken. The veil stopped its rampage. It stood in the middle of the carnage, the splintered iron pipe dripping slowly onto the polished floor, the silence of the dead pressing down. It looked directly at me, and I felt the cold, echoing presence in my mind, sharper and clearer than ever before, vibrating with triumph. Step lamb, Elias, beautiful, Elias. Its internal voice was grating and thick with brine, a language of the deep. Nu la nu katrian, you are the storyteller. It took a step back, the massive, barnacle-studded foot crushing the handle of the scalpel I had dropped. He viet v dieu nai. Kalai mwachi teet. Kong dak quain mot tu now. De la man qua ta dan cho nu. De la kachian tuet voi not, Write about this. Tell every detail. Do not forget a word. This is my gift to you. This is the greatest story. Then, as fast as it had appeared, the thing vanished, not dissolving, but seeming to simply walk out of the spectrum of human vision. The sirens began almost immediately. Not local police, but state troopers, already converging on the facility after the initial reports of the disturbance. I looked down at the ruin around me. My mother's body. The dissolved face of the guard. The empty husk of the young mother. I was covered in the sticky, dark residue of death and the corrosive salt of the monster. The scalpel, the one I had just tried to stab it with, was now under my bloody hand. There was no calling the police. There was no explanation. I was found kneeling over the bodies, drenched in gore, holding a murder weapon, in a room where carnage defied physics. I scrambled up, grabbing my mother's car keys from where they had fallen. I ran. I ran past the front desk, past the approaching lights, past the impossible truth. I burst out of the hospital doors and into the night. The world would never know the mariner's veil had been here. They would only know Elias Thorne, the troubled son of a disgraced Maine family, who had finally snapped and butchered 7 people, including his own mother, in a terrifying rampage inside a state psychiatric facility. The veil had won. It had successfully framed its narrator, and now my story, my desperation, my terror, my confession, was no longer just fuel for the fire. It was the only evidence the world had. I was completely alone, a mass murderer on the run, driving Eleanor's sedan toward the deep, silent woods. I was writing this entry on my phone, hidden and shaking, because the creature had demanded it. And because if I stopped now, the story would die, and I would have no explanation left. But I knew one thing: I had to understand why it wanted the story so badly. And I knew the answer lay not in Oakhaven, but in the dark history the Thornes had buried. I was heading for the only place I might find it, the old family hunting cabin, miles from the sound of the waves. My last chance to find the truth before the final, inevitable act. The cold followed me from the asylum, a thick, coastal damp that seemed to have settled permanently in my lungs. I drove for 2 days, moving inland until the smell of salt was replaced by pine and decomposing leaves. The Thorne family's hunting cabin was less a sanctuary and more a memorial to neglect, a gray, sinking structure hidden deep in the Maine woods, far from any paved road. I barricaded the door with an antique chest and slumped onto the floorboards, the adrenaline finally giving way to a sickening, heavy emptiness. The image of Mother, Eleanor, her vibrant, sharp face replaced by that grotesque, misty violence, played on a loop behind my eyes. I was a mass murderer now, according to every news report I had risked glimpsing on my phone. The Oakhaven butcher. They said I had gone completely mad, a claim made easier by the blood-soaked scene and the fact that I was a Thorne. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the drip of moisture from the roof and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls. I started pacing, searching, needing to do something other than stare at the ghosts. It was the scent of forgotten violence, not blood, but a spiritual gunpowder, that guided me. Underneath the cracked, bearskin rug, near the hearth, the floorboards were marginally newer. They lifted easily, disturbed centuries ago and hastily replaced. The box was tin, rust-eaten and heavy, sealed with a thick patina of age. Inside, nestled beneath layers of yellowed velvet, were not jewels or weapons, but paper. A journal bound in cracking leather and a cluster of loose, brittle letters, tied with a black ribbon. The script was cramped, elegant, and deeply panicked. The date etched into the first page read, October 14, 1804. Augustus Thorne. My great-great-great-grandfather. The man Oakhaven history remembered as a devout man who massacred half his fishing crew and drowned himself attempting to sail through a winter storm. I read until the meager sunlight filtering through the dirty windows failed, and then by the light of a sputtering kerosene lamp, tracing the frantic lines with a dirt-stained finger. Augustus's early entries chronicled a familiar fear, the strange, suffocating fog, the vanishing catches, the unsettling silence of the sea birds. Then came the change, the terror that bled through the ink. We saw the shadow tonight. Not mist, but the form of mist. It walked the docks, taller than any man, and the smile it wore was the mouth of a hungry deep. He described the initial deaths, accidents the town dismissed, but which Augustus knew were guided by the mariner's veil. Caleb's death, Mark's death, Sarah's death, they had happened before. History wasn't repeating, it was resonating. The journal became less about observation and more about frantic, terrifying theory. Augustus had spent years studying the entity after the initial terror, poring over obscure folklore and forgotten Gaelic rites preserved by his ancestors. And then, the horrible explanation, scrawled across 2 full pages, the ink darker as if pressed with desperate strength. It is not a spirit of the dead, nor a demon of the Christian God. It is a hunger, a vacuum-given form. It is a parasite of the narrative. It feeds not upon flesh, but upon the story of its consumption. Our fear, our witness, our whispered terror, this is the spectral currency that gives it mass. I dropped the journal, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my chest. It wasn't the bizarreness of the monster's method that shattered me, it was the recognition of my own terrible complicity. Augustus continued, explaining that the entity required a storyteller, a Thorne, to anchor its growing legend. The creature needed the fear to spread and calcify, transforming the amorphous dread into visible, tangible power, a process Augustus chillingly called the solidification of terror. When I first saw the shadow of the mariner, it was only a ripple in the humid air, a momentary visual distortion. But when the first reports of the massacre spread, when the town feared, believed, and spoke its name in prayer and curse, it gained substance. It spoke with a hiss then, and its arms were defined by the brine it stole from the atmosphere. Augustus knew he had to cut off the food supply. He had to stop the story. The final, harrowing pages detailed his attempt to starve the veil. He decided to take the blame. He would become the definitive horror story, eclipsing the truth. I confess to the slaughter. I claim their blood from my own hands, my own diseased mind. They will call me mad, they will speak of my insanity, but they will forget the shadow. They will bury the terror in the name of human frailty, and the entity will retreat back to the depths, unfed, unheard, awaiting the next poor soul foolish enough to speak its name aloud. His plan was a noble, tragic madness. He intended to commit the ultimate act of narrative erasure, replacing the monster's story with his own self-condemnation, then silencing himself forever. But the veil knew. The letter, stained and folded into a tiny square, contained Augustus's final words, written moments before he sailed his own ship into the rocks to stage his death. It came to me tonight, clear as the midnight moon. It stood by my cot, already heavier, its skin like the barnacled hull of a sunken ship. It whispered, the sound of ropes snapping in the gale. You cannot die, Thorne. You are my beacon. Your family is bound to the telling. You have given me a great introduction, one they will whisper for a century. Do not fear, Augustus. Another Thorne will continue the legacy. The terror was absolute, crippling, and immediate. The Oakhaven Confessions. My blog. My public, detailed, frantic accounts of Caleb, Mark, Sarah, and now the Hospital Massacre. Every time I posted, every time I begged the world to believe the invisible horror hunting me, every time a new follower shared the story, or a cynical commenter dismissed me as crazy, I was feeding it. I hadn't just exposed the mariner's veil, I had given it a microphone and an audience. I had transformed its slow, century-spanning hunger into a viral blitzkrieg. The entity had spent 200 years slowly accumulating dread through whispered legends. I had given it enough food in 2 months to fully solidify. The very act of seeking validation, of demanding the world acknowledge my truth, had delivered the monster to full physical manifestation. I was not the victim. I was the willing, though unknowing, architect of its apotheosis. The veil was no longer a shadow on the periphery of Oakhaven. Thanks to me, it was now fully corporeal, ready to reap the harvest of attention I had so meticulously sown. I looked down at the knife I had carried since the asylum, the surgical tool I had tried, uselessly, to thrust into the chest of the thing that murdered my mother. It was pointless. Violence wouldn't stop it. Exposure had fueled it. There was only one action left that could possibly starve the narrative parasite: silence. Absolute, final, non-negotiable silence. And for a Thorne, silence was death. This is the final entry. If you are reading this, I have failed. If this post cuts out mid-sentence, know that the veil has found me, and the story has become its flesh. My name is Elias Thorne, and I am not a madman. I am a victim, currently operating on borrowed time and the lingering fumes of sanity. For the last 5 months, the police, the media, and the sick little keyboard warriors of the internet have painted me as the sole perpetrator of the Oakhaven atrocities. They say I am a Thorne, a descendant of the mad lineage that settled this cursed piece of Maine coast in the 1700s, and that violence is simply the family trade. They are wrong. I started this blog, the Oakhaven Confessions, not to confess crimes, but to chronicle the predator that has hunted me, stalked this town, and used my fear as its very substance. I write from the Thorne house now, a crumbling Gothic silhouette against the gray Atlantic sky. The air here tastes of mold, antique rot, and that pervasive, terrible salt. If I stop writing, if the stream of consciousness ends, assume the worst, assume I have been silenced, and that the thing which wears the sea like a cloak has finally claimed its storyteller. This is my last testament. Believe me or don't. It makes no difference to my fate, but it might save your silence from becoming its victory. It all began on the 29th of March, a cold, miserable night at the old municipal dock. We were celebrating Caleb's exodus. Caleb Harris, my oldest friend, had finally saved enough to leave Oakhaven, to escape the crushing small-town weight and the inescapable shadow of the Atlantic. We'd had too much cheap rye and too many stale beers, laughing about the Thorne curse and the decrepit house I was forced to inherit. Caleb stood near the edge, facing the churning black water. He raised his bottle in a toast to freedom, and that's when I slipped. The old wood was slick with brine and algae. My feet went out from under me, and the world fractured into unbearable white noise. I struck my head hard against a rusty bollard. When my eyes fluttered open, everything was distorted, swimming in a sick yellow haze. Caleb wasn't there, but the rope he'd been holding, a thick, frayed docking line, was taut and rigid, stretching impossibly upward, vanishing into the darkness above. And then I saw it. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a presence, the sheer weight of concentrated nothingness. The mariner's veil. It was immense, a towering column of sea spray and condensed fog, its silhouette vaguely human but stretched and warped, impossibly tall. Its texture was that of cold mist and frozen salt, shimmering in the dock lights. Where a face should have been, there was only a vast, empty expanse, punctuated by a smile. Not a smile of joy, but a deep, wide, gaping tear in the mist, utterly without feature or soul. It was a void shaped like malice. I watched, frozen, as Caleb's body slowly drifted up from the black water, suspended by the impossibly stiff rope. He wasn't struggling, he was just limp, his eyes staring at the bruised, moonless sky. The veil merely observed, radiating a silence colder than the deep sea. Then the vision snapped shut. I woke up days later in the hospital. Concussion, fractured skull. Caleb's death was ruled a tragic, alcohol-fueled accident. He fell, hit his head, and drowned. The police, led by the perpetually skeptical Chief Peterson, dismissed my account of the towering mist and the floating body as post-concussion delirium. But Oakhaven didn't dismiss it. The whisper started instantly. Elias Thorne pushed him. The Mad Thorne blood finally surfaced. The isolation was immediate and profound. I was a pariah, haunted by the knowledge that I had seen something utterly alien murder my friend, and now, that alien thing was watching me. The sensation was constant, the feeling of dried salt on the back of my neck, the faint, metallic scent of the freezing tide in my bedroom. I tried to combat the dread by writing. The blog became my anchor, a desperate effort to catalog the madness and keep my grip on reality. I was talking to myself, but I needed the illusion of an audience to stay coherent. The veil was still subtle then, just cold spots and fleeting shadows in the periphery, but the tension was ratcheted tighter every day. Only two people tried to genuinely help: Sarah Jensen, who always saw the best in me, and Mark Ellis, who had a stubborn sense of loyalty. They insisted I needed professional help, real doctors, not a keyboard pulpit. We met at the old lighthouse 2 weeks later, the air thick with the promise of a coastal storm. Sarah was trying to convince me to leave Oakhaven. Mark was pacing nervously, glancing at the crashing waves. The attack was too swift, too brutal, to comprehend fully. It didn't come from the water. It materialized from the air itself, condensing from the dense, stormy atmosphere between two flashes of lightning. The mariner's veil was no longer just mist. It was denser, a hulking shape of dark, swirling brine, its presence exuding an intense cold and a sharp, overwhelming odor of dried sea salt and ozone. Mark screamed once, a high, panic sound, before the veil turned its attention to him. There was no sound of impact, only a sickening pressurized thrum. Mark's head didn't bleed, it simply exploded inward, instantly atomizing into a thick, fine red vapor, a mixture of blood and pulverized bone, that immediately crystallized into flakes of crimson salt, dusting the stone floor of the lighthouse like ghastly confetti. The smell of dry, concentrated sea air was so strong it was suffocating. Sarah didn't even have time to shriek. The veil moved with impossible speed, a manifestation of pure predatory intent. I saw its weapon clearly now, an ancient, enormous fishing hook, milky white and jagged, looking carved from a walrus tusk or perhaps deep-sea coral. It wasn't swung. It was wielded with terrifying precision, not designed to kill quickly, but to inflict maximum narrative terror. The veil used the hook to methodically tear Sarah apart. I remember the sound, a horrific, wet ripping, like tearing heavy, saturated canvas. But instead of the gushing scarlet that should have soaked the floor, a clear, viscous, unnervingly thick liquid flowed from her wounds. It smelled purely of salt and dead fish. It was not blood, it was pressurized seawater, the very essence of the ocean's depth, animating her dying form. I stood there, paralyzed, soaked in Mark's salt residue. Then the veil turned that hollow, smiling void toward me. It loomed inches away, and the cold penetrated to my very marrow. I didn't hear the words with my ears. They resonated directly inside my skull, vibrating like a plucked ship's cable. You will tell this story, Thorne. The entity lingered just long enough to ensure I understood the magnitude of the horror, then it simply dissipated back into the stormy atmosphere, leaving behind only the evidence of impossible carnage. I called the police, stumbling through a manic, incoherent explanation. When they arrived, they found Mark and Sarah mutilated beyond description. And they found my hunting knife, carefully planted near Sarah's body, covered in what the forensics team would later identify as human tissue, Mark's tissue. The town's suspicion solidified into certainty. Elias Thorne, the raving Thorne heir, was the killer. The blog went viral that night. The traffic soared, but the comments were a cesspool. They didn't see a victim. They saw a lunatic desperate for attention, a pathetic killer weaving fantastic tales to cover his tracks. The digital hatred was almost as cold as the veil itself. My mother, Eleanor Thorne, was the last person who cared enough to try. She didn't believe the entity, but she believed my terror. She drove me immediately to St. Jude's Asylum, 50 miles inland, our last, desperate hope for a medical explanation, a chemical fix for the hallucinations. We never made it past the triage center. The air pressure dropped suddenly, the lights flickered and died, and the emergency generator coughed to life, bathing the sterile white hallway in a flickering, sickly yellow glow. The mariner's veil arrived, and it was no longer a shadow or a mist. It was terrifyingly, aggressively present. It had reached level 3 manifestation, fueled by the explosive virality of the Lighthouse Massacre and the sheer terror I was emitting. Its form was now substantial, gray-blue, its texture like waterlogged, ancient timber and barnacle-encrusted metal. Its surface rippled faintly, perpetually moist, and its mass was enormous, the size and color of a raging coastal tempest embodied in a single entity. Eleanor stood in front of me, placing a hand on my chest, a final, futile gesture of maternal defense. The veil didn't hesitate. It reached out, not with the hook, but with a massive, dripping hand that plucked a rusty, decades-old crowbar from a forgotten maintenance cart. With a movement that was both impossibly slow and shockingly swift, it brought the bar down. It struck Eleanor's neck just above the collarbone. The sound was a wet crack. Her body collapsed instantly, the head severed with brutal finality, rolling once on the polished linoleum before coming to rest near a discarded medical chart. The massacre at St. Jude's was brief but absolute. The veil moved through the hall with mechanical intent, enacting violence that transcended mere murder. I watched it use a length of industrial wire to casually snap the neck of a frightened night nurse. I saw it level an antique flintlock musket, which somehow fired a blast of concentrated salt spray and pulverized bone dust rather than lead, instantly disintegrating the chest of a hapless security guard. Worst of all, I witnessed it approach a frightened, heavily pregnant woman who had crawled under a desk. The veil didn't kill her immediately, it simply stared down with that hideous, smiling void, and the woman's terrified scream suddenly cut out, replaced by a sound of indescribable, wet tearing from inside her. The horror was so complete, so incomprehensible, that it broke something fundamental in my mind. Driven by pure, desperate instinct, I grabbed a scalpel from an unattended cart and lunged, burying the thin blade directly into the entity's torso. The metal passed through nothing. There was no resistance, only the sensation of plunging the knife into freezing, dense air. The veil paused its butchery and slowly turned that terrible, immense form back toward me, its non-face tilting in what I recognized as satisfaction. It rumbled, the sound like the crushing of deep-sea trenches, echoing in my head. Beautifully done, Elias. Write about this. Tell every detail. It didn't need to pursue me. It knew I would run, and it knew I would write. I stumbled out, found the keys to my mother's sedan still clutched in her decapitated hand, and drove away from the asylum lights, leaving behind a scene that no earthly authority would ever believe was the work of one man. The veil was now too strong, too real, and Oakhaven was quickly drowning in the narrative of my fictional madness. I drove until the coastal pavement became dirt track, and the dirt track became overgrown trail. I holed up in the last place I could think of, a derelict hunting cabin my great-grandfather had used deep in the northern Maine woods, miles from the nearest salt air. The silence here was deafening, but it was a reprieve from the omnipresent taste of the sea. It was here, hiding beneath the rotting floorboards, that I found the truth, the key to the horror that was destroying my family and my town. The find was simple: a small, lead-lined iron box containing a brittle, leather-bound journal and a single, decaying letter, dated 1804. The author was Augustus Thorne, the supposed founder of the mad lineage. Augustus wrote, not of madness, but of terror. He chronicled the arrival of the sea spectre, a creature that first appeared as a shimmer, a bad omen, then slowly began to claim the lives of the early settlers through horrific, theatrical violence. The explanation chilled my blood and crystallized my failure. The sea spectre was not just a demon, it was a narrative parasite. Augustus realized that the creature didn't feed on fear alone. It fed on the telling of its violence. Each retelling, each whisper of its brutality, each piece of evidence it forced people to discuss, gave it mass, cohesion, and power. Slander, gossip, history, these were the nutrients that turned the spectre from a phantom into something capable of wielding a physical crowbar. The greater the fear and the wider the audience, the more rapidly it materialized. Augustus wrote of the spectre's glee as the survivors gathered in terror to recount the night's carnage. He understood that the story itself was the plague. In a final, chilling entry, Augustus detailed his ultimate sacrifice. He couldn't kill the spectre, so he decided to starve it. He meticulously killed every remaining witness and survivor, then meticulously staged the entire scene to look like a solitary man's descent into madness and murder. He confessed, publicly and loudly, to being the singular agent of the slaughter. He buried the truth to save the future. The spectre, already taking shape, but not yet fully formed, intervened, not to stop the murders, but to stop the suicide. Augustus wrote the creature's chilling refusal. "You cannot die, Thorne. You are my beacon. You will live to be the legend that contains my tale." Augustus was forced to live out his days as a reviled, insane killer, his story preserved not as a truth of supernatural evil, but as a cautionary tale of human malice. And for over 2 centuries, the spectre was reduced to mist, starved by the mundane narrative of the mad Thorne. I dropped the journal, the realization hitting me with the force of a tidal wave. I, Elias Thorne, had reversed Augustus's sacrifice. My blog, my desperate, manic need to justify myself and tell the truth, the Oakhaven Confessions, had been the single greatest meal the Mariner's Vale had ever consumed. Every click, every share, every comment calling me a liar or a killer, was a nutrient that fed the monster, turning the vapor of maritime myth into the tangible butcher of St. Jude's. I had not been fighting it, I had been narrating it into existence. The Vale arrived at the cabin 2 hours after I finished reading Augustus's journal. The sound of its arrival was no longer a subtle drop in pressure or the distant rush of the tide. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of feet on pine needles, and the clattering sound of ancient hardware. It was finished. It was here. The Mariner's Vale stood in the doorway, blocking the last sliver of fading light. It was no longer a shadow or a tempest. It was perfectly, terrifyingly real, fully manifested. A colossal human figure, dressed in a perpetually sodden, oilskin coat that dripped salt water onto the dusty cabin floor. Its face was skeletal, covered in gray, fish-belly white skin stretched tight over a wide, jagged grin. Its eyes were 2 patches of black, stagnant water, and its teeth were long, narrow points coated in slick green seaweed. The air around it was impossibly cold, and every step produced a wet, grinding sound, like sand tearing metal. The smell of death and high tide was overwhelming. It raised one of its massive hands, the fingers elongated and tipped with yellowed, broken nails. "Thank you, Elias Thorne." The voice grated, no longer an echo in my head, but a physical sound, the crunch of 1,000 tons of icy water breaking wood. "You are the greatest storyteller of your line. You broadcast my artistry globally. I am replete. I am finally solid." It stepped into the cabin, water surging around its boots. Oakhaven is mine! The sea is mine! And the story is ready to spread! I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. The knife meant nothing. The only thing I had left was my voice, and I had learned, too late, that my voice was its weapon. I looked at the old shotgun hanging above the fireplace, Augustus's own 12-gauge. Killing the veil was impossible. But perhaps I could starve it. With trembling hands I reached for my laptop. I knew that even in my death, the veil would win if my final, true confession was circulated. The Oakhaven confessions could not become history. It had to become a lie. I typed rapidly, pulling up the complex, encrypted credentials I had given months ago to an anonymous follower, a user named Lighthouse Keeper who had been particularly zealous about my story. I sent the private key and the blog login with one final, desperate message, * delete everything. Now. Wipe the server clean. Make it look like a hoax. Make me a fraud, *. The cost was absolute. I would die as a monstrous liar, a failed author who made up a grotesque fantasy and killed his friends for attention. My name would be forever synonymous with the violence I desperately tried to stop. But if the world laughed at my story, if they decided the whole thing was a bad horror fiction written by a sociopath, the veil would be denied its feast. It would begin to dissipate, starving for the credibility of the narrative I had destroyed. I stood up, gripping the heavy, cold barrel of the shotgun. The mariner's veil watched me, amused, knowing its physical form could withstand any conventional attack. "You plan to kill yourself?" it mocked. "A final, dramatic act for the tale?" I walked past it, ignoring the freezing spray and the putrid stench. I walked out of the cabin, onto the overgrown trail leading toward the highest point on the coast, Oakhaven Cliff. "No," I whispered, not to the entity, but to the memory of Augustus. "No more narrative. No dramatic ending. Only silence." I walked toward the cliff edge, where the sea spray still traveled 50 miles inland on the wind. I would die alone, without witnesses, without fanfare, without the chance for my death to be chronicled or sensationalized. I would ensure the story of Elias Thorne, the true story, died with me, replaced by the mundane, uninteresting conclusion of the sociopathic killer who took his own life. I checked the timestamp on my phone. Lighthouse Keeper had acknowledged the message. The deletion process would start in 60 seconds. I stood on the precipice, the cold wind whipping my hair. Below, the gray waves churned relentlessly. The veil followed, but hesitated, sensing the denial of its final, glorious scene. This is the last sentence. I hope the server is slow. I hope you only see the blank screen. I am pulling the trigger now.